presentations. I'm not going to say anything about Pat. Margaret Warren. Margaret was kidnapped into a family of award-winning artists. She first began breaking cameras at age 3. By age 12, she had won awards and had published in newspapers. Her artistic pursuits expanded in range, and she began showing and selling her work in watercolor, pen, and ink. After a vigorous foray into cryptology, yes, cryptology, she developed a professional career in the computing sciences applied to art. She has owned and operated her own multimedia and computing consulting company, Karma, with a C, it's a pun, Productions, for over 15 years. Karma provides photographic lab services, electronics, and audio engineering. In 2002, Margaret began showing her art regularly in local and regional venues along the Gulf Coast, including the Pensacola Museum of Art. She has won many awards and juried shows. Most recently, she has been touring her Porsche Junkyard series at Porsche events all over the country, and pieces from that work are now in collections in the U.S., Sweden, and Netherlands. There's also one of her pieces in our library. In 2007, she placed first in the Porsche Club of America Porsche Parade Art Show in the professional division. Her own art car is a hand-painted 1965 Porsche 356 Coupe, and it won third prize at the Houston National Art Car Parade in 2009. It is a colorful, abstract, neo, semi, hemi, demi, expressionist, psychedelicist rendering of art cars of the late 1960s. Also in 2009, Margaret was invited to serve as a voting committee member for the Art in State program to select art for the new Science and Technology building up at UWF. Over the past few years, she has been engaged in collaborative research project with Patrick Hayes. I interfered with their work significantly, involving contemporary art and the semantic web. And this is the topic of their talk today: semi-logical, hemi-popularist, expressionistic, formalistic, pragmatist, post-classicistic, neo-Hegelian ontology. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Margaret Warren.
Thank you, except that Pat's going to start this. Except that Pat is going to begin this talk.
I'll start this.
You're going to start.
I think we now work with these, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go.
I don't know what I did wrong. Oh well. So I'm going to set the context for our work. Linked data, linked image data. First of all, what does linked data mean? Now, I think many of you will have heard this. It's a current buzzword in the world of the semantic web. It's the latest manifestation of the semantic web idea, and the one that's getting probably the most energy at the moment. The idea is to use RDF, which stands for Resource Description Format, which is a standardized formalism for encoding machine-readable knowledge on the World Wide Web, for those of you who don't know that. To use that to create a web of semantic links between data items. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of data out on the web, and I don't just mean web pages. I mean databases, lists of cities, airport codes, vast amounts of machine-readable, organized information in structured form. The idea is to take the idea of linked data is to make links between those data items. And the meanings of the links are described by what we call lightweight ontologies. Ontology is just an organized system of concepts that's usable by machines to draw conclusions and make connections. And the idea here is to have the emphasis on lightweight, and we'll be seeing that again and again. Next slide. So, currently, or with what is now considered conventional data technology, data is basically in silos. There's huge amounts of data organized in a database or a knowledge base or some such system, usually with some sort of internal coding that's proprietary or local to that particular system, and in which a lot of money and energy has been invested. And you access it through an API, a programming interface, or a query language, or some such thing, in which you ask the system, do you know this? Or what do you know about this topic or whatever, and the system does its internal stuff and comes back with the answer and sends it back to you. That exists. What linked data wants to do is to basically get away from that picture and replace it with this picture, in which the links are between not the silos, not the huge, large-scale things, but between the individual data items in the silos and linked directly to other data items. And a link here is not just a pointer, not just an address, but an address plus a short description that describes the relationship between the data items, or between the items that the data is about. Next slide. So, here's a little example, a tiny example from a project which has started off as a sort of basically three people having this idea in a back room, and is now one of the world's largest such repositories, called FOAF. So that's a friend of a friend. So FOAF is a vocabulary and a set of conventions that you can, if you type FOAF into Google, it will find it for you, that lets you put a little bit of information on your website that links to other people who are your friends, that you've declared your friends, to pictures of you, to information about where you live, any information you want, to your mailbox, to your home page. And those links can be followed by computers and utilized. So a great web of connection between people has been set up. So you see these, and remind the sort of messy syntax if it makes your eyes go blink. But this is what's the word? Encoded.
Mailbox.
A secret hash that links to someone's mailbox. And the #1 sum is an indication to the machine of what kind of decoding to use on it. So this is essentially a link to something that's actually the mailbox belonging to who? A person called Dan Bree, who's just actually Dan Brinkley. And this is the URI, the link to his, to actually him, in his FOAF record. So this is the kind of way in which these things come about. A little chunk of information, readable chiefly by computers, using, and we said lightweight ontology, using this notion of, these are the elements of ontology in this case, knowing. This person knows that person. This thing is that person's mailbox. This is that person's name. See also as a sort of generalized label on a link, meaning, well, that's got some more information over there. Okay, here's a bit of Tim Berners-Lee's personal card. Anyway, next slide. Writing these lightweight ontologies, emphasis on lightweight, is an art, not a science. Well, writing any ontology is an art, really, but especially these. Because this is a new idea. Ontologies, as they're often called, have been around for a while now, and they tend to be thought of as kind of heavyweight, big things that, international agreements are, the idea here is something that can be used by ordinary people to make these links very easily. They have to be small. Whoa.
Sorry.
Oh.
I thought something might happen there.
God bless Bill Gates. And therefore they have to be sort of minimal, and they're often very sort of underdefined, and deliberately so. So FOAF, for example, defines a class of people, and it defines it as being the class of people. That's the definition. No analysis given at all. It's almost a joke. Agent is another class it has, and this definition of agent is, I think, things that make stuff happen. That's actually the documentation of the term agent in the FOAF homepage. And it's deliberately written in a sort of folksy way, as a kind of like poke your finger at philosophers kind of thing. So it's saying, look, we can't define that. But what it can say, and it says this in a way that's readable machine, is that, well, whatever the people are, they're a subclass of the agents. So every person is an agent, and there also might be other agents as well. In fact, there are. On the computer. So this kind of minimal kind of relationship between rather fuzzily defined classes is the sort of style that you tend to see in these lightweight ontologies. And there's a whole lot of kind of, you might sort of folklore, sort of style of good form things to do. You try and reuse relations and classes that have been defined by others instead of defining your own if you can. And by and large, the meaning of things is understood to be specified by the actual way they get used. So the part of the documentation is supposed to be giving advice to people out there when they write up their links and create their link data, so try and use it in this kind of a way. Okay, next. This is not just an idea, this is really happening. This is a diagram often reproduced in this, it keeps getting changed. This is March 2009, which is the most recent one we could find, of chunks of data that have been linked in this way. I'll give you an idea. This is the US Census data. That's huge. DBpedia is Wikipedia transcribed into machine-readable form. All of it. That's, I forget the total size of this, but it's in the many, many millions of data items. There's a lot, and this is now being added to it, by the way. Since this was done, the Library of Congress has put its entire catalog into linked data form. So there are now, let's see, as of November 2009, 13.1 billion RDF triples are estimated to be linked in this way. And the number's growing every week, every day. Okay. So that's linked data. What about linked image data? Well, now there are images in the linked data world, but they're almost all illustrations. So on the FOAF, and the Friend of a Friend project, people will link to a picture of them. So here's my picture. Okay. You can see my portrait on the link site. We're interested in, Margaret and I have always been interested in images in their own right. Images as, works of art, for example. And the images are not just illustrations of something else, they actually are the topic. So we're trying to sort of put images as first-class entities on the linked data world. Now, there's been, as these are actual document covers I've put there for illustration, there's been a number of pieces of work done by the W3C and many other actually mostly W3C, on image annotation, the semantic web, media fragments, that means little snippets of video, or stills from video, so it's still images. But none of these have really had the same focus that we've wanted. They focus typically on, in this case, on the things that the images are images of. If you're interested in finding a picture of the Prime Minister of Uzbekistan or something, then that's the ontology for you. So it's really about the people and things in the images. For example, finding news catalogs. And then others have been really designed by museum curators for sort of doing curation and cataloging of artwork rather than describing the artwork itself. So we want to find out what we want to be able to capture what image makers themselves say about their images next. And I think this is you.
Me. Well, yeah, I think what Pat was saying is there's a lot of work that's been done out there already. Of course, you can see by that large diagram, and some people have talked about images, so you would wonder where is the spot for us. But basically, what has been done amounts to about this already, which is just that there are things and images that are depicted, and that's about it. So, that's just not sufficient. I came to Pat some years ago because I have a large catalog of images that I wanted to be able to describe for the web, and just doing simple tagging is not enough. And this is basically still sticking with the simple tagging. So we might ask ourselves these questions. Well, when we began working, we started with using CMAP tools, and I sat down and did about at least a dozen of these, and we also went to other artists. We've been out in the community since I participate a lot with the art community here. And we started trying to look at what all kinds of knowledge we would want to say about a piece of art. This is not a snapshot, and this is the image that's out in the library, by the way. So, so there's a big gap between what we want to say, and this is obviously very difficult to formalize, versus what is being done right now in the linked image data world. So we started out with a simple image. And this is a simple snapshot. This is not a snapshot that I would ever want to do anything with. It's just, but it does have some interesting information in it. Someone might want to see it at some point in time. But you can see. Here's a list, basically, kind of a grocery list of what's being depicted. Now, one of the ontologies that's out there already that depicts topics that are related to journalism, for example, it attempts to have a class for like every type of depictable thing there is. There's a class of important heads of state, and there's a class of I don't know,
opening
railroad cars.
Events to do with opening of some institution.
Yeah, I mean every single event has a class associated with it. Well, that's a heavyweight ontology. We don't want to do that, but we started saying, well, is there something else that we can say? We know there's got to be something else we can say, and here's one reason why. Somewhere in this image is JFK. I mean, he is really actually right here, but here in the corner. But But there's a lot more depicted in this picture than just JFK, and yet the subject of it for journalism purposes would be JFK. So there's a difference here between if you were going to list everything that were depicted in this image, this is not the primary subject. So there's obviously some division here of more that you can say about an image for the web. So this is where...
Just say, that image, in case you didn't notice, that was in the news about a month ago.
Yeah.
Someone found this image. They'd had it all these years in their attic.
Right.
And it shows JFK cavorting with nude girls,
yes.
which would have been a huge scandal at the time.
At the time.
But is now simply of, how about that, historical interest? Who would have thought it?
Yeah, who are they?
So, Pat and I spent a lot of time sitting around talking about images, and once we got past Pat saying every 5 minutes, it's not in the image, it's in the scene, meaning, obviously that the item itself is not actually inside of an image.
I have this bee in my bonnet. Every time I'm driving and I look in that little mirror, and it has printed on the glass, objects in mirror are closer than they appear. And every time I read it, I think, idiot, the object is not in the mirror.
It's depicted. It's depicted in the scene that the mirror
Exactly.
reflects.
Why didn't they say that on the mirror? Oh,
okay. So we got to this wonderful breaking point here where we said, okay, well, what does this depict? And I'm saying, well, it depicts diamonds. And Pat's like, no, it depicts nothing. And I said, wait a minute, it depicts diamonds. So we went back and forth and back and forth. So I said, okay, let's just go on this premise that Pat might be right. And let's just exactly. So it goes downhill from there. No. And so we said, okay, all right, so this depicts nothing. But what it does have in it are pictorial elements. And here's another one, and here's a more famous one. By the way, that previous picture is a painting of Pat's, so on his wall in his family room. So, but this one is a bit more famous example, a Pollock, and this also depicts nothing, and I'm sure Pollock would agree with that. But it does have a lot of what we would call pictorial elements. So we started doing some more research on this pictorial elements idea. And we took one of my photographs, and here's one that I would have a really difficult time describing, because what's depicted in this picture is literally an egg, a test tube, a transparent layer of another photograph, and a piece of jewelry. So that's what was actually literally depicted in this image. But what I want to say about it is that it's got some shapes in it, like here's a shape that I think looks like a female torso. Here's a shape that looks like a brain, and here's a shape that looks like the torso is sitting astride a seat of some sort. So I call this picture Surfing with Psyche. Basically, to get back to the point, just to reiterate the point once again, because you all may not see all these things like I do, I'm the artist, is that, again, we get back to the point that what we're trying to capture is what image makers themselves say about their work, and that, or someone who has an interest in wanting to mark up the work. It doesn't necessarily have to be the image maker themselves. So we started thinking about this idea of pictorial elements more closely, and naturally, if in art, there are these pictorial elements that are, in fact, well-known elements of art. We've got lines, marks, forms, shapes, textures, spaces. This is what's literally described as falling into a piece of art. So we thought, okay, let's have a class of pictorial elements.
By the way, that's why we call them elements, because of this definition which we found online in a well-known online lexicon of art terms.
Right. So when we split up this idea of depicting versus pictorial element, things that are depicted versus things that are pictorial elements, we found that we were able to say a lot more things. We could say actually that even though an X-ray of a torso doesn't really look like a torso, it does actually depict a torso. But here we've got something that looks like. Now, this very well may be a depiction, which I'll get to in a few minutes, but for our purposes for right now, this looks like a female torso, and this looks like something that's more like an iconic female torso. This might really be a person, but we don't know, or it's maybe just a cartoon person. This is probably really a person, so she's really depicted. Not the hard part, but the female torso there. So we found that we were able to have. It's not really a sliding scale exactly, but there are ways that you could now fairly easily see these different categories that you could put these types of, be able to take all these different pictures of female torsos, for example, and put them in these different
yeah, I mean, I think it's actually, rather than a sliding scale, it's more like there's two dimensions. I mean,
yeah.
We certainly hadn't, and I don't think anybody else who's designing these ontologies had done previously, what we hadn't done until we got to this point is separate out the ideas of being a depiction of, in the sense of, you know, what was in front of the camera, or what the artist was trying to make a drawing of, on the one hand, and something appearing like something else on the other hand. And those are really two separate ideas. So that's why we call the second one looking like, looks like.
Right, depicting.
So depicts and looks like. And an ordinary photograph, the kind of things you find on Friend of a Friend, are all just like mug shots of people. They always coincide. Of course it looks like the person, or you wouldn't have chosen that picture. And of course it depicts that person, otherwise there's some faking going on. So they always have coincided. But the point is they needn't. You can separate them out. And when you look at wider class image, you have to. That doesn't look at all like a torso, but it does. It's very important to know that it depicts the torso of Mrs. X Smith of patient number so-and-so. Otherwise, you know, the wrong person gets the treatment.
Is that like the photograph pairs of people who look like they're pets?
Yeah, right.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
We'd be able to describe that, actually.
Yes, we would be able to describe that.
Looks like, but doesn't depict.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm going to just reiterate that the whole idea of this is to come up with an ontology that's sort of in a sweet spot. It can't be heavy. We can't describe every single thing. But we do want to find a way to describe more than what's being described now just by the notion of depiction alone. So, but we said, well, we can't, we're not going to, this could be either. This could be a depiction of a torso of a female mannequin, or it could also be a pictorial element that looks like a female torso. Or both. In fact, back here, the second image could easily be, because it looks more like a shape of a female torso, so it could also be a looks like. And that would be okay in our ontology. And you'll see why a little bit more later. So the more we talked about pictorial elements and what exactly was a pictorial element in an image, we started realizing that if this top piece here, if this is just an image all by itself, forget about this one down here, if this is just an image, then it can depict someone, then that piece, that same piece inside a larger image can also depict that same item, which means that basically if a part of the image can depict something and the whole image can depict something, then the whole image must also be a pictorial element. So,
it also means that depiction applies to pictorial elements rather than to whole images,
right,
which is another change from the simple mugshot view of things.
Right. So, and here's another example of that. So here, sticking with the female torso theme here's the entire image basically looks like a female torso. It's not anyone depicted, it just looks like. But here is a female torso that's actually depicted, and that's the entire image. So this is the entire pictorial element that's depicting a female torso. Okay, and So, and sticking with the same sort of theme, again, this relates to what the person doing the marking up wants to say, or the person. I mean, Picasso said many times that this is Marie-Therese Walter. So we all may look at that and say, well, that's just looks like a female person, or it looks like an abstraction of a female person. But to Picasso, that really was this person. So it's okay for the person who's marking up their image to say that this is a depiction rather than a looking like. Pat did this torso, and he can tell you exactly who that is. And I think it's Joy, maybe. I'm not sure, but
no, it wasn't Joy. It was Stephanie.
Stephanie. And so
one of our models.
This depicts rather than looks like. Now, someone else might want to say it looks like, but if the person marking up says it's depiction, and it's depiction. But this is okay. It works for our ontology. And it sounds deceptively simple, but it actually can do a lot functionally in the machine language. Okay, so we said, well, you know, not everything that's depicted in an image is that important. A lot of times you go out on Flickr and you see people that tag every single little thing that's in an image. They'll tag red and blue and, you know, candle if it's sitting on the table, and they'll tag, you know, there'll be a keyword for every single thing that they see depicted in that picture. Well, some of those things depicted are just not really that important. So we created actually a property that kind of is a larger property that larger than depicts, the notion of depicts, called shows, meaning that everything that is, and it's a relationship between the image and the thing, meaning that everything that's depicted in the scene is theoretically shown. But depiction is a hierarchically level greater than that.
Yeah, let me just emphasize that. I mean, part of the sort of part of the idea of making these ontological distinctions, providing this terminology in the ontology, is so that people can use it to mark up in intuitive ways. So we're constantly sort of saying to ourselves, well, would you want to say this kind of thing? And what the sort of strict philosophical notion of depiction is the one in which it's in the picture, it's depicted. Everything. It's a blade of grass under the guy's foot. When you take a portrait of someone standing in a meadow, that blade of grass is depicted because it's in the picture. But that isn't what people say intuitively. If you say to them, what's this a picture of? They don't mention the grass. They mention the person. Maybe they mention. If you push them, they'll say, well, there's some trees. But they don't mention every single thing in the picture. So we wanted to provide a sort of two-level classification here. It's like, all right, stick to it. You know, this depicts the car, maybe, the people, sure. It depicts that building, if you're interested in the building. Maybe it depicts the trees, but no one's going to say it depicts that ventilation shaft, you know.
But it does show that.
But it is in the picture. And it might matter, you know, I don't know, a building survey might say, did that house have a ventilation shaft? Oh, it was in that picture over there, let's go and check. So we introduced shows as a sort of second, what's the word? Second-rate version of depicts. So you have a kind of two-level classification. So you can talk about things a picture of using depicts, and you can just mention all the other crud using shows. So there's no real philosophical justification for that distinction, but it seemed to correspond to intuitions that people have when they talk about what pictures are pictures of.
I don't at all mean to jump the gun or anything, but do you capture anything sort of more holistic, like the Dolly thing is an acid trip or melting reality, or?
Oh, we do. Well,
oh, absolutely.
We do, but that's not exactly what we're trying to do with the ontology at this point. We do have a notion of conveys.
You're jumping ahead.
Yeah.
Wait, we'll get to it.
Yeah, we're getting to that. We do have a notion of conveys, because there is another, again, we're trying to link up with other data that's already out there on the web. There's in DBpedia and in another ontology called SCOS, which is Simple Knowledge Ontology System. Then we have we have this notion of conveys, which can convey something like, okay, this conveys a metaphor for the passage of time, or this convey, you know, I mean, that's a bit of an extreme example.
Or
but
conveying a mood, like sadness.
A mood. So conveys actually represents the things that are a little bit more subjective. So, but we have this three-tiered kind of system for what is showed what is shown, what is depicted, and what a subject is. So getting back to that JFK image, then with the ontology we can now pick subject, and subject is functional in this ontology, which means we've restricted it to being only one item, so really the person doing the marking up is going to pick one thing that they if they really think it has a subject, this is the thing that it is the subject about. While it can depict all of these other items, it does have this one functional subject. And again, it goes down to the person marking up the image. I mean, we had this discussion with Robert that, well, I might not see the same things that another person might see. Well, that's of course obviously true. But what we have is on one end someone marking it up, and on another end trying to search for it. And if you can use the ontology to get a little bit more descriptive, then that's all you really need to do. That's because our notion of conveys will link up to all of this other data that is already out there on the web that is already formalized. So the more data that's formalized, the more we can link to those particular notions. So what we have to have is this very small, lightweight system that the machine can understand that will just let us separate into these very simple but sophisticated categories. And so this tiered system has just, I've been out there on Getty Images, which is a big commercial site for purchasing commercial stock photography, and done a lot of research in this. And they have an awful lot of items out there that are where if it's got, in fact I have an image down here later in the slideshow that's like, I mean they list everything. They list 150 different things. If it's got a blade of grass in it, they'll put grass. So who knows how it ranks when they're searching to come up with these things. So we split this up into this idea of shows and depicts, a main subject, and then things that can be conveyed by the image. So I only put this back in there just to point out about the ventilator. Okay, so something else that was exciting about these pictorial elements is that we picked out a picture like this Keith Haring image, and we said, okay, well these are pictorial, let's call these pictorial elements. They look like, for example, an iconic heart. They look like an iconic, human figure. IHMC's logo is an iconic running man. We said, okay, if we can describe this as having, all of these pictorial elements that are described, that look like these shapes. And I think, did you want to add something about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, there's this interesting place here where the ontology technology, or technology is the wrong word, the sort of philosophy behind the ontology language idea doesn't quite get to where we want it to be. And it's kind of interesting because, we want to say this looks like a heart. Well, it doesn't, of course, look like a heart. You ever see an actual heart? An individual, particular heart? They don't look like that. That's a sort of a heart icon or something like that. But even if so, there's an issue of what's the difference between an actual thing and an iconic thing, right? But there's also an issue of supposing we accepted that this is, never mind the iconicity, but this looks like a person. But in the ontology world, if you say that, then you're saying there is an actual person, a particular person, probably with a name and a social security number, that this looks like. Because you're talking about the individuals. And of course, you don't mean that. You mean it looks like it's sort of person-shaped. It looks like a kind of typical person. And in the ontology world, there's no such thing as a typical X. There's just X's. And then there's classes of X, like all people. But that's a category, right?
There's all elephants.
And there isn't any, and this has come up in a number of other domains in the ontology world. It's like, how do you talk about, the typical African elephant? African elephants are typically larger than Indian elephants, right? But does that mean that the typical African elephant is bigger than the typical Indian elephant? Or is it a statistical statement? Or yada, yada. But it's, these sort of difficulties confront us in the face when we try to sort of deal with things like this, because images are full of iconic or sort of typical things like the running man. So one idea we had, so just a little bit of technical stuff here, is that we could say that it looks like the class, actually category. Of course, that doesn't make sense. You can't look like a category, but we could use that as a convention to convey this idea that it was a typical member. But it turns out that would break, those of you who know what I'm talking about, you'd be an owl full if you did that, because it would break OWL-DL reasoners, and most of the reasoners out there are OWL-DL. So that would be a kind of technical no-no. Another thing we could do, which actually, I know you've even seen this, Scott, you put this on the slide this morning.
Yeah.
We could say that it was like the concept of a heart. And you might think, how the hell can you say that? And the answer is that there's this existing ontology called SKOS, stands for Simple Knowledge Organization System, that's already out there in the linked data world, that has the notion of a concept of a thing in it. So you can point to something and say, in SKOS, and say, I'm the concept of that. And now you can refer to me, right? Where that can be a heart, or the class of hearts, or whatever. So it distinguishes between concepts of things and actual things. So you can sort of refer to an idea. Now, it's not clear that they intended it to be used this way when they developed that, and I've spoken to some of the people who did it, right, at the Semantic Web meeting. And I don't think they did intend it to be used that way, but we could use it that way. But I go into this just at this point, just to emphasize just how sort of fluid a lot of these decisions are right now. Because all of this stuff, it's like walking on jelly. Nothing is set yet. You know, all those 3 billion linked data, almost every term used in every one of them, its meaning is still just a little bit up for negotiation.
Right.
And it really will be determined finally by the way the whole damn planet sets in its use of these terminologies. So doing something like this is a high-risk move. If you do it in public and people recognize and think, neat idea, and they copy you, then you have just created a meaning for the planet.
Right.
If they don't copy you, you're history. So it's a high-risk maneuver, and we haven't decided what to do about that. Anyway.
Okay.
Pat, why can't it, if that's your reasoning, why can't it be called, those humanoid figures, why can't they be called, for instance, an icon of a person?
They could, but then we'd have to explain what an icon is to people.
Right.
I mean, that might be the best way to go. That'd be the most honest way to go. Is just to sort of bite the bullet and say, look, these things are icons. You all out there, if you're going to use our ontology, you've got to understand what we mean by an icon, roughly, and use it consistently. Okay. Yeah, that's a perfectly honest thing to do. I was sort of I guess I was interested in sort of quick hacks that would avoid having to do that and the risks associated. But you're absolutely right, Greg. Probably we will need to do that, actually.
Well, icon's a very loaded word.
It is. It is.
The words are all loaded as hell. That's why you have to document what you mean.
I mean, I bring in concepts like caricature.
Right.
And so you can have icons that are depictions, especially religious icons. Are supposed to be
I know. And you can have depictions of things that are iconic. I know. I photographed the Mickey Mouse sign.
We do have a way of actually dealing with that. I mean, we have a way of, especially when we get down to user interface ideas, of being able to allow again, it has to do with who's doing the marking up, and who's doing the searching.
I have a category of Elvis impersonator. That would cover all of it.
Okay, on another.
Get back to the easy stuff for a second.
For a second. This is actually just kind of a side note of interest, and we didn't correct that spelling on that slide. Anyway, when we started trying to define this image, we looked at it and said, okay, here's another great image by Pat. Pat was calling this a depiction of a particular model, but all of the area, and it pretty much explains it here, all of the actual area that represents the reclining nude is actually defined by the outline. So it's just a notion that, as we already said, pictorial elements can have space.
We don't want to say that the outline depicts. I don't want to say that, but the outline depicts. Right, I want to say the actual white space that the outline outlines depicts. But that's nothing. It's white space. So we have to allow that to be a pictorial element. Pictorial elements are not just marks or patches. They're actually also can be negatives. They can be implied by other things.
Right. Okay, so, and this is an example of what the code would look like for that. So.
Right, so if we've got that distinction, by the way, this actually uses the concept of a linear pictorial element as opposed to a line as opposed to a patch, and this implicit as the white space as opposed to explicit, an actual mark. If you've got those two distinctions, then you could define, this defines in OWL the
Union.
OWL definition of line drawing.
Right.
Which is an image, all of whose visual parts are either implicit or lines. In other words, the only marks are linear. So you could define things like red line drawing, there's a whole bunch of sort of things you can build up descriptions now that are somewhat non-trivial in terms of how they characterize the image.
Right. I mean, we're not saying, by the way, that we can do everything with our ontology.
No.
We're not. This is not the scope of our project at this point. We're only trying to get a little nugget that is a little bit better than what already exists. So. Here's an example where, looking at this herring image, when I found this herring image, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and then I tried to find it again. I don't know, I didn't save it or whatever, so I was trying to find it again. Well, going back to Herring's catalogs on a Herring website, the only way to look through his works are to go by year, and I have no idea when he created this image. I don't really know that much about Keith Haring's work. I do know I'm looking for a picture with a red heart in the center on a white background, basically. That's the way I'm describing it in my head, the way I would want to search for that. Well, naturally, I can't find that as it stands right now, looking through any kind of Google image search. But and we've now added this concept of having pictorial backgrounds, which can be all white, or having depicted backgrounds, because the depiction here, and I mean in this case, in the picture of the Blue Angels, the background is not really that significant. But again, if you were looking at a Flickr picture of this, it would be tagged, Blue Angels, jets, formation, maybe, whatever, a whole list of things, and it would have sky. And generally, people will write sky and clouds, okay, things like that when they're tagging, and. If we're simply able to have the notion that images can have a background, that adds a whole lot to being able to find things. So we would be able, using our ontology, for me to find that image of the Keith Haring, being able to say, I'm looking for the one with the red heart and the white background.
I mean, the other thing you might not know, unless you happen to be really interested in Keith Haring, is that white backgrounds are rather unusual in his work. Most of his paintings are done on colored grounds. So this happens to be a very salient feature for finding it, but there's no way to use it as a point of view.
For months I've been trying to find an image, a Dali image online that is a line drawing of a head that looks like it's unwrapping. And I've been unable to find that just by doing Dali searches, using any number of potential search terms. But using our ontology, we would be able to find that, because we could say, well, it looks like a head. I mean, provided it were marked up in that way. So here's another example. Again, we have the Blue Angels. We have my cat, who's named Angel. And then we have this image that has an area that to some people looks like an angel. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you actually believe that or not. Again, it's if somebody wanted to say it looks like an angel, they could. Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, there's two levels of belief here. You can believe it looks like an angel, and you can believe it depicts an angel. Some people believe it depicts an angel, which is a whole other game.
But there's even a lot of machine techniques for combining images, combining keywords in Flickr, for example, and looking at the word uses and pairing up all of the different combinations of the words. And in a lot of those cases, they ignore personal pronouns. They ignore things that are capitalized. They also, there's some things they just can't get. They can figure out the word sense in a lot of cases, and they have a pretty, but it depends on what all they're comparing in these tag lists. So, but this is something that our ontology would be able to do. We would be able to say, and it doesn't even really matter. Again, the subjective parts don't really matter. Does somebody want to say it's a specific formation? Does somebody want to say it conveys military power? That's okay. They can say all of that. But just having this separated notion of pictorial elements versus depiction and versus shows, because clouds and sky here are not important to the image of the cat. They're just, it happened to be in the cat. Somebody might think they were important, but to be able to search on this, that would do something like that.
The main point is that if at the moment, basically, all you get are keywords. And you'll get angel and you'll get cloud and all of these, and that's all you'll get. And just even a little bit of structural description should produce a lot of bang for the buck in terms of retrieval, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see the difference between has depicted background and shows? Do you have a...
There has depicted background and shows. There's not really it has to do with what you want to.
If it has a depicted background, then that background is shown, yes. But well, even maybe not that. It could well be that there is no thing, in the sense of a thing depicted, which would count as the whole background. You're not obliged to put any of this information in, remember. These are all just optional description tools you have. But if you want to say the background of this is clouds, or if you want to say, for example, that in the case of the Dali, that there are mountains in the background in the scene.
I would say everything that's depicted in the background is also shown.
Necessarily saying they were shown. And you can also say that something was shown without saying where in the picture it was shown.
Right. Well, I would say everything that's in a depicted background is also shown. Yeah. It doesn't hurt to say that.
That's probably true, although our ontology doesn't require it at the moment.
Right. So this is the ontology so far, which it does meet the requirements of being a lightweight ontology. Is there anything you want to add about this picture?
There's a missing inverse link between these two.
Right.
And Tom knows why it's missing. I couldn't get Pico to draw the damn thing, that's why.
Okay. Okay, so there's a few things on the ontology that we didn't really explain yet, and I'll explain them in the next slide. This work versus facsimile of, the property of facsimile of between image and work. And that basically says that, a lot of people put a lot of weight into that word work. They think, did you create a work or a work of art? Well, we're not putting that kind of heavy thing on it. We're just saying if you have some image that you've created, whether it exists in a digital domain or whether it exists outside of that in the physical world, then and you may be doing something else with it. Pat's piece here of a simple chalk drawing here, he might not ever want to do anything like that. He's not going to call that a work of art, so to speak. It might become a work of art one day. Who knows?
Too late.
But it doesn't really matter. Or did you already went over it? Yeah. Okay. But at that moment, it was a work versus an image, and the image just means basically the identity on the internet. The image is the actual piece, the actual file that information is attached to. So we had to differentiate between when you're talking about an image, whether it is whether it really exists as a separate entity, or what is actually the file name, the file that exists on the internet. And so we said if you have this, so for example, that top image, would be a work. And the image that we're talking about on the internet is a facsimile of that work. So,
I mean, the real thing that got this was that one of the very first existing vocabularies that we found kind of as an inspiration is that it's not actually semantic web oriented. It's not part of the linked data world. It's just a big standardized vocabulary, but it's been very well worked on and thought through by a large number of people in a large number of museums. And I'm saying this because I'm desperately trying to remember the acronym and I can't. Anyway, it's designed for use
VRA.
by...
It's a VRA.
The VRA,
Yeah.
that's right. By museum curators for maintaining catalogues and curation records of works, of things in museums. And it's huge. And almost the only image-oriented thing in it is depiction, as always. Everybody starts with depiction. And an idea we got from it, actually, was that you can depict mythical things, as in the Dali. That depiction doesn't have to always be of real things in the world. But all the rest of that vocabulary is about things like what school the artist was working in, where the work was created, what it weighs, how much is it worth, what its dimensions are, what medium is it on, is it done on canvas or on board, or etc. All about the actual physical thing, right? The thing that the museums have to worry about and not get wet and not scratch, right? And of course, all our images are digital images. So that contrast was sort of forced on us very, very vividly at the beginning. We had to make this distinction between the Mona Lisa and, my photo of the Mona Lisa. And then we needed a relation between them, and we decided on this facsimile of, which we decided to call it facsimile. We don't want to say that this depicts this.
Right.
Right, because that's, you could. If I take a photograph of the Mona Lisa very carefully and make a very nice, neat copy of the Mona Lisa and digitize it on a website, you could say I've got a depiction of the Mona Lisa. And in a sense that's true, but that's not the same notion, truly same sense of depiction as the one we've been using for the picture of my Uncle Joe or the picture of the people standing looking at the car.
But if you have you standing next to the Mona Lisa, then then we just
exactly.
say that the Mona Lisa is depicted in.
So, and in fact, it can even be that a depiction of a work of art might be higher resolution than a facsimile of it. So, a really high-quality photograph taken in a museum that happens to have a beautiful picture of the Mona Lisa in one corner, right? It could be a depiction because it's a photograph of the museum. And a rather low-grade thumbnail intended to sort of just be a little illustration on a website, only a few hundred pixels, could be a facsimile because it's really only intended to reproduce the image poorly. So this is the notion of sort of reproduction rather than a photograph of.
Right.
That was one of the early conceptual distinctions that took us a while to get clear.
Well, this is not a pipe.
Right.
No, that's really to do with reference. This is a picture of a pipe as opposed to being a pipe, right?
Well,
Right.
the painting depicts a pipe.
Yes, the painting depicts.
Wording underneath it is making the point.
Yes.
It's not a pipe.
Yes, that's right, absolutely, right. But then that would be true here and here for us.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, that is our beginning of our ontology is roughly published here. If we could get Perl to work right.
It has a permanent URL, which is the access point to it.
Been having problems with a lot of Perls lately.
It's considered very good poor manners to not have a Perl for your linked ontology.
I don't think that's really the rest of the slides that we have are kind of just supporting things.
Yeah, I think we've got to the end of the talk.
This is basically the end of the talk.
So questions? Any observations? Cool.
I think that Google orders the things you get when linearly orders them in terms of the match between what terms people use and which thing they go to first when they get over time.
I gather actually, I just read an article about this, very complex, but that's basically
I wonder
what.
if the same thing could be true here, you just sort of seed the thing, and something like that over time would sort of sort out what people mean, what they...
I don't know. I mean, I've tried using that. I mean, I've tried looking at those algorithms and exploring whether that would work or not. And I don't think it would work as well as the ontology. I mean, over time.
I'm not talking about ontology.
Yeah.
I'm talking about people's fumbling around and trying to
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Well, the user interface idea that we have actually
Yes.
sorts out a lot of that, and especially with Tom's input has been invaluable to come up with some ideas of what we're building to enlighten, to kind of cue people in on what's going to be the most the easiest, giving all kinds of salient clues for what's the best way to
Sort of develop the language and people
Right.
develop the dialect sort of.
Exactly.
What we want to do is build a user interface, and we didn't talk about this in any detail. Well, we didn't mention it really, but this is on our plan. Is to design and build a user interface for marking up images using this ontology, which makes it very intuitive and natural for people to use and produces the markup in the ontology in a sort of standardized way. Rather than sort of say to them, okay, off you go, get an editor, type up your RDFA or your OWL, with all the angle brackets and make sure it's in XHTML and use our ontology. I mean, people won't do that, we know that. Well, some people will, but they're the people who go to the conferences. The people in the artists won't do that. So we need a user-friendly interface that lets people mark up images naturally, not by marking them up by sort of saying things about them they want to say. And we're in the process of thinking hard about designing that. Yeah.
This is a markup of the image that Pat has of the reclining nude.
This is the kind of markup you'll get from
and
that.
this is a XHTML plus RDFA
This is
document
that red drawing of the sleeping nude, and then we can actually. I mean, this is quite interesting. Already out there in existing linked data, there are
that shows that.
Right.
It shows.
But bring it back a second. There are the concepts of nude person, adult female human, and reclining posture. Right. We didn't have to invent those. They're out there already. We linked to them. So there's a lot of quite remarkably sort of intuitive, natural terminology already out there being used that we can link to. Which is one of the, we don't have to do it all ourselves. We have to provide the ways of connecting to all this. That's part of the problem.
Right.
But
when you describe your user interface that you're talking about, who's the user? Are you talking about the creator of the image?
someone who,
Generally speaking,
the creator of the image.
Although an art critic could mark up an entire gallery of images from the Rijksmuseum, or I mean, if someone who it's whoever's really compelled to want to mark up the image.
Right, but it's at that end, not at the consumer end, not the person looking for the image. They don't have to do that.
No, the person who's motivated. I mean, I was motivated. I started trying to put my images on the web in my own online gallery back in 1992 or whatever, my first website, and I immediately stopped after, well, gosh, if I list everything that's depicted in this scene, it's surely not going to matter much.
The thing you should know is that Margaret has approximately 100,000 images that she needs to mark up. So, scale factors are we have to wait till the web. Just on her website, we've got scale factor issues. If it takes more than a couple of minutes each, we're dead.
Though, on Flickr, I mean, the Library of Congress put a subsection of their catalog on Flickr just to see how many people would tag it. And overnight, they had something like, 50,000 tags. Because some people like to just sit around and
there are astonishing crowd effects that you get. If you can get something out there where the world can look at it, there's a lot of people out there who are willing to do this kind of thing. And voluntarily.
Right.
Greg.
And there's that little tool where you pay people little cents.
Yeah,
What's the name of the what is the name of it? The Mechanical Turk. Mechanical Turk. Right.
There's also a game that you do with that too.
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Have you ever tried playing it?
The clairvoyance game.
Yeah. It's boring as dirt.
It's boring.
People play that for the longest.
Hours.
Somebody played that for like 12 hours at a time, though. And people really get addicted to that.
I wouldn't trust the output of anybody who could possibly do that for 12 hours.
That's the point. It makes sure that you can.
Well, true enough.
Yeah.
Greg.
I was just wondering, you still need this notion, I think, of like a committee that decides then what's important to say about things, because
No.
Wait, how would I search for photographs by Margaret Warren that are very vibrant in color? I mean, I don't see any way, unless somebody knows to tag them that way.
No, but that's the point, Greg. We don't know. Right. If you're doing it through tagging, then you have to rely on the searcher and the tagger using the same word.
Right.
Or very closely related words.
We're not trying
or
to
word
solve that
combinations.
problem.
We think it's
actually.
far more likely. It's far more likely if you give people vocabularies, they can make structured descriptions in. Now, it's not guaranteed. The search is never going to be guaranteed, right? You're never going to be guaranteed of a match. But all the experience of linked data so far is that even a little bit of structured description is way better than nothing. Way better, right? Even if you could just combine words in pairs with linking phrases, just to make simple phrases. So if you could decompose vibrant into some description using simpler terminology that even had slightly more than chance likelihood of being used by both people, then you're way ahead of the game. And that's where we're trying to get
But you can't do that now. You can't go into libraries and say something like that. You can't say, well, I want all the books. You can, maybe you've had a committee that has come up with certain classification, using a taxonomy. And there are people out there who have taxonomies for controlled vocabularies for describing images. In fact, Melissa just left, but the Reuters news agency, they even have some machine tagging that will take a term like ambulance. And then it will automatically add on emergency worker or some sort of tag like that. Like the machine will add that on. So we're not exactly trying to solve that problem.
It's still, though, if I'm not mistaken, it still is the case. It's sort of the equivalent of people who complain that this program forces the user to think a different way in order to be able to use the program. It's sort of the same thing, right? You have to learn the vocabulary.
Yes. Yes.
This is more like a visual. Once you see it, you kind of
But he's right. He's right. It does require that there's some discoverable correlation between the way the searcher is describing it and the person who tagged it.
Very heavily on the notion of intuitive description.
Yes, we do.
It should come naturally.
Indeed, and that itself is almost certainly, for example, culturally dependent and also other dependencies.
Right.
Yes.
Consensus.
Yeah.
Right. And it's very, very testable, right? So we know from ample psychological research that you can bring somebody into a laboratory and sit them down and show them something on the order of 1,000 slides of works of art, 2 seconds each, and then bring them back the next day and give them a recognition test, and they'll do about 90%
Yeah,
correct.
that's right.
Right? So mark up 1,000 of those 50 million, right? Bring somebody in, sit them down, show them 3 seconds each, bring them back the next day, and say, search and think of one that you saw, and then search on it, and just see what words they use. And if it matches,
That's a good idea.
If it matches your intuitions about depict, looks like. So yesterday, did you see any images that depicted reclining nudes? Right. Well, go find one that comes to mind and see what happens.
Right.
That's kind of getting a little bit askance. A lot of the questions that have been asked here.
That's a good idea.
It's not coming out with the right description.
Sure.
It's coming out with a description from the perspective of the image maker.
Right.
A lot of the things that like the Picasso or who was
Marie-Therese Walter.
For him, that was a depiction. And
Right.
he was adamant about that.
Right.
Nobody else would say it.
Well, actually, if you ever see a photograph of her, you'd recognize it from that painting.
I like to use this example on something. Like here's a search on the symbols.com, which I love. If you're trying to find any kind of bizarre symbol, you've got all these different ways you can look at it. Versus the symmetry, whether it's an open or closed shape, and whether the shape is curved. So are you going to find something? Yeah. Anyway, I think this is if with something like our ontology, you can.
What would you like? Choose. You want it single-axis symmetric?
Yeah.
Triple.
Multi-axis.
Multi-axis symmetric?
Yes.
Okay. You want open or closed?
Yes.
Open. Okay. Curved or straight? All right. Good. And do you want crossing lines or non-crossing lines? Crossing is much more interesting. Absolutely. See what we get. See, I'm a Mac person. There you go. That's a few of them.
That's just what I was thinking.
But
Yes,
I mean, I think this is a fascinating site. It kind of gives you the difference between what I think that the equivalent, sort of visually, that our ontology can do is that once the user kind of has an idea of being able to say, well, wait a minute, back to that image of the torsos, the different varying degrees of torsos, whether it's depictions or looks like. And sure, you can say they're both. You can easily say they're both. And then if that's the case, you're not doing much more than just tagging it, but that's okay, because if someone actually has been able to select something that's more like looks that is more like looking like versus more like, and even if they do a search and they get back a lot of examples and say, that's not at all what I was looking for. I want something that isn't a real torso. I want something that looks more like, that's a drawing. Then that's going to fall under. And then you don't have to really worry about whether it's a cartoon or whether it's a stick figure or something.
It's a colorful, abstract, neo, semi, hemi, demi, expressionist, psychedelicist rendering of art cars of the late 1960s. Also in 2009, Margaret was invited to serve as a voting committee member for the Art in State program to select art for the new Science and Technology building up at UWF. Over the past few years, she has been engaged in collaborative research project with Patrick Hayes. I interfered with their work significantly, involving contemporary art and the semantic web. And this is the topic of their talk today: semi-logical, hemi-popularist, expressionistic, formalistic, pragmatist, post-classicistic, neo-Hegelian ontology. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Margaret Warren.
Thank you. Except that Pat's going to start this. Except that Pat is going to begin this talk.
Start this.
You're going to start.
I think we now work with these, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go.
I don't know what I did wrong. Oh well. So I'm going to set the context for our work. Linked data, linked image data. First of all, what does linked data mean? Now, I think many of you will have heard this. It's a current buzzword in the world of the semantic web. It's the latest manifestation of the semantic web idea, and the one that's getting probably the most energy at the moment. The idea is to use RDF, which stands for Resource Description Format, which is a standardized formalism for encoding machine-readable knowledge on the World Wide Web, for those of you who don't know that. Information readable chiefly by computers using, and we said lightweight ontology, using this notion of, these are the elements of the ontology in this case, knowing. This person knows that person. This thing is that person's mailbox. This is that person's name. See also as a sort of generalized label on a link, meaning, well, that's got some more information over there. Okay, here's a bit of Tim Berners-Lee's personal card. Anyway, next slide. Writing these lightweight ontologies, emphasis on lightweight, is an art, not a science. Well, writing any ontology is an art, really, but especially these. Because this is a new idea. Ontologies, as they're often called, have been around for a while now, and they tend to be thought of as kind of heavyweight, big things that, international agreements are, The idea here is something that can be used by ordinary people to make these links very easily. They have to be small. Whoa.
Sorry.
Oh.
I thought something might happen there.
God bless Bill Gates. And therefore they have to be sort of minimal, and they're often very sort of underdefined, and deliberately so. So FAR, for example, defines a class of people, and it defines it as being the class of people. That's the definition. No analysis given at all. It's almost a joke. Agent is another class it has, and this definition of agent is, I think, things that make stuff happen. That's actually the documentation of the term agent in the FAF homepage. And it's deliberately written in a sort of folksy way, as a kind of like poke your finger at philosophers kind of thing. So it's saying, look, we can't define that. But what it can say, and it says this in a way that's readable machine, is that, well, whatever the people...
Presentations. I'm not going to say anything about Pat. Margaret Warren. Margaret was kidnapped into a family of award-winning artists.
Yeah.
She first began breaking cameras at age 3. By age 12, she had won awards and had published in newspapers. Her artistic pursuits expanded in range, and she began showing and selling her work in watercolor, pen, and ink. After a vigorous foray into cryptology, yes, cryptology, she developed a professional career in the computing sciences applied to art. She has owned and operated her own multimedia and computing consulting company, Karma, with a C, it's a pun, Productions, for over 15 years. Karma provides photographic lab services, electronics, and audio engineering. In 2002, Margaret began showing her art regularly in local and regional venues along the Gulf Coast, including the Pensacola Museum of Art. She has won many awards and juried shows. Most recently, she has been touring her Porsche Junkyard series at Porsche events all over the country, and pieces from that work are now in collections in the U.S., Sweden, and Netherlands. There's also one of her pieces in our library. In 2007, she placed first in the Porsche Club of America Porsche Parade Art Show in the professional division. Her own art car is a hand-painted 1965 Porsche 356 Coupe, and it won third prize at the Houston National Art Car Parade in 2009. It is
plus a short description that describes the relationship between the data items, or between the items that the data is about. Next slide. So here's a little example, a tiny example from a project which has started off as a sort of basically three people having this idea in a back room, and is now one of the world's largest such repositories, called FOAF. So that's a friend of a friend. So FOAF is a vocabulary and a set of conventions that you can, if you type FOAF into Google, it will find it for you, that lets you put a little bit of information on your website that links to other people who are your friends, that you declared your friends, to pictures of you, to information about where you live, any information you want, to your mailbox, to your home page. And those links can be followed by computers and utilized. So a great web of connection between people has been set up. So you see these, and remind the sort of messy syntax if it makes your eyes go blink. But this is what's the word? Encoded.
Mailbox.
A secret hash that links to someone's mailbox. And the #1 sum is an indication to the machine of what kind of decoding to use on it. So this is essentially a link to something that's actually the mailbox belonging to who? A person called Dan Bree, which is actually Dan Brinkley. And this is the URI, the link to his, to actually him, in his FOAF record. So this is the kind of way in which these things come about. A little chunk of info. To use that to create a web of semantic links between data items. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of data out on the web, and I don't just mean web pages. I mean databases, lists of cities, airport codes, vast amounts of machine-readable, organized information in structured form. The idea is the idea of linked data is to make links between those data items. And the meanings of the links are described by what we call lightweight ontologies. Ontology is just an organized system of concepts that's usable by machines to draw conclusions and make connections. And the idea here is to have the emphasis is on lightweight, and we'll be seeing that again and again. Next slide. So, currently, or with what is now considered conventional data technology, data is basically in silos. There's huge amounts of data organized in a database or a knowledge base or some such system, usually with some sort of internal coding that's proprietary or local to that particular system, and in which a lot of money and energy has been invested. And you access it through an API, a programming interface, or a query language, or some such thing, in which you ask the system, do you know this? Or what do you know about this topic, or whatever? And the system does its internal stuff and comes back with the answer and sends it back to you. That exists. What linked data wants to do is to basically get away from that picture and replace it with this picture, in which the links are between not the silos, not the huge, large-scale things, but between the individual data items in the silos and linked directly to other data items. And a link here is not just a pointer, not just an address, but an address